haven't offered an update on this greenhouse or high tunnel pretty much this whole growing season, so I thought today we'd take a look inside, see where things currently are, and what the work is that we're working on now as we transition from summer production into fall and hopeful good deep winter extension this season. So stick around. First thing I want to say is it's a little bit of a mess in there, and that's part of what we're working on right now. But kind of a theme with a lot of our videos is to not show you just the finished, cleaned up niceness, but the reality of the process, and to be honest about what's worked and what hasn't. This is a space where you can see, so on the right is the north side and on the left is our south side, and what our focus is to really reclaim and renovate the south side to get it transitioning towards fall production. Last night Sasha and I spent some time and we pulled the tomatoes that were in here and pulled some of the weeds. We laid out all the tomatoes that were ripe or underripe, mainly underripe. And the next pass, and this is a slower process because we're not just doing very simple crop production in here, there was a lot of basil that was kind of hidden under the weeds. We've left that, and so what she'll do is go through and cut the basil to either make pesto or just to, there's not that much, so maybe just to harvest and cook with. And we'll hope to dig up the basils and pot them up. So as we do that, we can make a quick video shot. And so this way we have basil we can bring inside for the winter. And part of the process too is that because some of my nursery work overlaps with some of the crop production Sasha's focused on, there are things like Hablitzia and Cardoon, these interesting perennial crops. So in fact, this is the work that I need to work on next, is to go through and collect Hablitzia seed, or Caucasian mountain spinach seed. So the majority of the weeds that are right in here are actually these vines, which are pretty high value perennial climbing, super cold hardy spinach-like leaves. Those yellow leaves, late summer, they're pretty haggard looking. So I'm going to go through and collect seed, cut them back, dig them out, pot them up, and we'll move down the line. So this slow, detailed process. Once this bed is cleared out fully and open, we'll top it off with rich, aged compost, and then start the process of seeding it out for fall. On the right side, we're still in production mode. It's a little bit more straightforward. Sasha put basil as an understory to the south of tomato production, and she's gotten a lot of tomatoes, and considering neither of us really have the skill or the wherewithal to do the management on tomatoes where we prune all the internodes and weave them properly, we've still got a fair amount of tomatoes and there's still more to come. And in the high tunnel, the blight has been near nothing, which is exciting. There's a little showing up on the bottom leaves. And I think what our idea is in here is we'll cut out whatever leaves look discolored, do a little bit of pruning and management, open up this central channel, soak it thoroughly with water, lay in a thick layer of compost, and seed this out to a fall crop like carrots, beets, other roots, and leave the basil and the tomatoes to provide shade and shelter in this otherwise really hot area for those plants. And maybe what we'll do is we'll post this video before we seed out what our fall and winter crops are, in the hopes that folks watch the video and provide us some suggestions. We're Zone 5B, Central New York. We're at the very beginning of September. If this were your high tunnel, what sort of crops would you be thinking about trying to get in as we transition towards fall and winter? So I'm going to pause here. I'll do a little bit more work on the south side and then we'll pick up again. Some of the benefit of being a little bit more detailed as you do the work is you get some other bonus yields. So yeah, we missed this dill that was growing in there, but now we've got dill seed, which what we found is that when you collect seed from plants and immediately sow it back out, it generally coincides with the timing that the plants would want to drop that seed anyway. So we'll collect some of the seed for Sasha to cook with, and some of it we'll just shake these out over future beds where we want some dill. And part of the design direction of saying, rather than clearing this out and turning this soil and seeding it, well, first of all, adding a lot more compost is always, well, it feels like it's always a good thing. But beyond that, since these plants have been a little abandoned throughout the summer, there is just tons and tons of seed coming down into the soil. So if we can put a thick layer of weed-free compost on top and immediately seed it out, rather than tilling and turning, that should take the pretty intense seed load that's in here and just bury it. And so long as we continue that practice, well, I guess we'll see, won't we? So as I go to dig out the basils, I soak them with water from the watering can first, then dig them up, and basically once they come out of the soil, I consider them almost like fish out of a fish tank. They have to go back into something by the count of 10, in my opinion. This time of year, what I'm doing is a mix of rainwater and compost tea, and we're just going to collect them all in this bucket, which is in the deep shade, sheltered, and let their roots sit in this mix. And then this morning, once we're done with the high tunnel and it gets a little hotter and sunnier over there, we can move to the shade and pot these up and be able to keep them in the shade for a few days, because this is a fair amount of transplant shock that they'll go through. It's not super easy to dig up and pot up plants that are this far along in the season, but we should be able to do it. That same treatment was what I did last week on these Tulsi, or holy basil, that were in a walkway in the garden. And we put a few per pot. Sasha cut some back to harvest, and they're looking beautiful now. So that process works pretty well for us. The incidental harvest continues, and on this side we're realizing the basil is leaning over the path enough that it probably would benefit us just to be able to get access to do one really thorough harvest. So I'm going to go through and cut it back real hard, which will stimulate more fresh green growth if I do it right, and Sasha's going to run that through the dehydrator so we have some herbs for the winter and walkway for now. That's a lot more walking room. A pretty rough look for the basil. Certainly not best cultural practice, but I think if we give them a good soaking, put some compost around them, mulch them, they should rebound, and maybe we get a nice flush of fresh basil before frost in here. Quite a bit of harvest. Wouldn't be the best for fresh eating, but if we pull all the leaves off and dehydrate them, they should serve just fine for the winter. And on the far end, as far as access goes, this last Genovese basil, the last two over here, are not really in the way, so we're going to leave those and let them form seed. That should be enough seed for us to actually really go big on basil next year, since it works quite well for us. So this far end can be a little bit of a jungle and not really be in our way, so why not? And it's funny, just bushwhacking through into here, we realize how many more tomatoes there are to harvest, so it might be a whole other round of making some good things. This hasn't been watered or maintained much at all this whole season. It's amazing how productive it is without that. It's just the roots of these plants are near the edge of the high tunnel, and all the rain comes down, and we've got deep raised beds on the outside, so there's time for that water to wick in, and these plants are doing great without really any care. It's pretty lovely to see. So on with the rest. Tiny bit of trash and tags, but overall pretty clean. The Hibblitzia was so substantially rooted I actually need to bring the shovel in, which is pretty remarkable. Sasha's now going to go through and harvest the rest of the ripe tomatoes now that we have access down there. So she started on that process. She'll be back out in a moment. And I'm going to give this area a really deep soaking, and then we'll start getting some compost on it, and we'll make some decisions about, do we clear all the way down the rest of the line, or do we leave that and undersow it to a fall crop? We'll figure that out as we go. We've got about 15 minutes before that sun comes through the pines and really slams onto the high tunnel, and it'll be quite warm in there, so we're going to start moving towards getting compost in there before it's too hot to work. This is a container of aged compost. It's been resting for about a year now, and really rich material, tons of biochar. I'll use the shovel to fill 4 buckets at a time. The buckets make it much easier to dump the material in the high tunnel we found.
Full bones.
So rather than going through and sifting every bit of compost, we find where there are gaps in low places, and that's where the coarsest material goes. And that includes charcoal and bones and little sticks, and then it can get covered with finer material. So just a way of not having to do a lot of extra work and getting some benefit from it. Long enough video as it is, and also the sun is just now going to start hitting the high tunnel and be too warm to work. We recharged this tank from our rain tote, and I won't use it all, but we'll use probably 50 gallons to deeply soak the soil we brought in. So these beds are now very deeply amended with seasoned compost, sifted somewhat with the nuggets and chunks buried. And we'll leave the remainder of the foliage just in here to continue on the season and be kind of a nurse for what we sow out. It's dominant on the west side, which is good because it casts shade from the late day sun. And we're going to pause on the video here and again ask or solicit for feedback from folks. Zone 5B, early September, high tunnel without additional heat, but pretty buffered and pretty safe space. What do you recommend? We're thinking we're going to try carrots and beets, lots of different leafy greens, but maybe there's some key crops that you've had great success with that you would recommend for us, or some strategies or feedback on how we've gone about this. We'll do some update videos once we get ready to sow these out and how we manage keeping it nice for a germination bed. And Sasha will make a video on how she's going to process what we harvested, which is all that basil and tomatoes, if there's some interest. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you soon.